Good evening, everyone, and welcome to a very timely program, let's say. I'm Colleen Feige. I'm the president of the League of Women Voters in Edina, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to tonight's program, which is the U.S. Supreme Court in Perspective 2017-18. And our guest speaker tonight is Professor Timothy Johnson, so we're all looking forward to hearing what he has to say. One thing I just wanted to mention, the League of Women Voters board started planning this program in July. Now, honestly, we didn't know what October 4th was going to look like, but it looks like it's pretty timely, I would say. Anyway, let me say a little bit about the League of Women Voters for those of you that may not know, and many of you have already heard this before. It's a nonprofit volunteer organization that encourages informed voting and participation in government. The League does not endorse political parties or candidates, but we do take positions. And the position that tonight's program is supporting is the position of improving government. And this is what that says. The League strives to ensure that government at every level works as efficiently and fairly as possible. This involves continued attention to issues of transparency, a strong and diverse judiciary, appropriate government oversight, and funding. As I mentioned, our speaker tonight is Professor Timothy Johnson, who is the Morse Alumni Distinguished Professor of Political Science and Law at the University of Minnesota. He's a nationally recognized expert on Supreme Court oral arguments and decision-making. He has been published in a variety of academic journals and law reviews. In addition, he was on KARE 11 the other night. I saw him. And he has been published in The Economist, The Guardian, The New York Times, The Washington Post. He's been around a lot of things, so thank you very much for joining us. Tonight, he's going to deliver his comments, and then we're going to ask for questions from the audience. When you came in, you got a card to write your question on. We have a couple people that will be circulating the room. When you have a question, after he's done with his speech, raise your hand and they'll pick it up. We've got a couple experienced question sorters, and then I'll be asking him the questions. So it is my pleasure to welcome you, and thank you very much for being here.
Our boys, my wife is in the audience somewhere, laugh now at KARE 11 coming and talking to me. I generally won't go to them because we live in the South Metro, so they'll come out to me, and the first time they did, maybe 12 years ago, my boys thought it was the greatest thing that there were cameras in our house, and now they are bothered significantly by having the press come and talk to me. It's an inconvenience to Fortnite, if you know what that is, or to any of their other game playing because they have to be quiet for a half an hour or so while I talk. And sadly, I talk for half an hour and then they use 10-second sound bites. And I give them a hard time about that every time, and they know the game and I know the game. So, but I appreciate the introduction, Colleen, very much. This is a difficult topic for me to talk about tonight. Not because I don't love talking about it, not because I don't love talking to folks about what I love to study, but because there's just so much that could be talked about. And so I have never been accused, and this is something else my wife will confirm, of not being verbose. I might be the most verbose person you've ever heard speak. And so I'm going to really try to rein myself in, keep my comments as short as humanly possible in my world, because I would much rather interact with you all with questions. So if you have questions, please write them down on the cards, and I'm more than happy to answer absolutely every single one of them that we can in the allotted time. And so I thought about what I should talk about tonight, and there's not a whole lot going on with the Supreme Court right now. Things are pretty boring on the front. The first Monday in October was only 3.5 days ago now. The court hasn't heard any major cases, and there's not much controversy going on surrounding the court. So this might be short as well. I guess not, right? So what I want to do is give a short overview of what happened during the 2017 October term that ended in June. Just talk about some of the major cases, because that will give you a sense of what the court has done and the types of policies it has set, and in particular set once it got back to being a 9-member court, because it had been an 8-member court for quite some time. The shortest part of my talk will actually be a preview of the 2018 term that did begin 3.5 days ago, and the reason it will be so short is the court has simply not taken any salient cases yet. There is nothing, honest to goodness, nothing exciting that the court has taken. Probably the two most exciting cases are the two that I will talk about for a couple of minutes this evening, and if you have other questions, you may ask them. But until they get a 9th person on the court, which obviously seems imminent in the coming 48 hours or so, they are not docketing cases of much import at all. And then I want to talk a little bit, before I turn it over to questions, about this transition from Justice Kennedy to now presumably Justice Kavanaugh, and what difference that will make on the bench. We certainly are hearing that this means the end of Roe versus Wade. We are hearing that it is the end of any liberal decision for the coming couple of decades. But what does it really mean in terms of where a Judge Kavanaugh will sit when he becomes a Justice Kavanaugh, if that is what is going to happen, and how that difference is going to fundamentally alter the court, given who Justice Kennedy was? So those are the 3 things I'm going to try to do. It is just after 7. I will try to do that all in 20 to 25 minutes, because I think close to an hour of questioning makes a lot of sense in this particular political and legal environment. Okay? So let me just talk about 5 or 6 cases from last term that will have pretty major policy implications for all of us in the United States. The first, clearly the most important cases from last term, boil down to Trump versus Hawaii and the immigration policy. And while the court, in the end, says that the president has exercised or did exercise his power on the immigration front appropriately, it actually didn't go much further than that. Okay? It did seem as though that this was a quote-unquote anti-immigration decision, but if you look closely at Trump versus Hawaii, it was actually an affirmation of executive power. And let me be very clear. The current Roberts Court is one of the friendliest courts to executive power in the history of the United States. And it is no wonder that the administration won that case. Not because or in spite of the arguments about immigration and whether or not that policy was anti-Muslim or whether it was anti-anybody. That case for those justices on that court at that time was simply a case for them that was easy, because it was executive power. Now, we might not read it that way politically, and that's not going to be the effect politically, but that was, to be perfectly honest, and I'll reiterate it, not a difficult case for the 9. Because of their penchant to like executive power. And I will say this, that was true of the Roberts Court even during the 8 years of the President Obama administration. There were some fights with the Obama administration over particular policies. But ideology in that sense, or in the sense of maybe having a conservative court, and I apologize for the pun, trump a Democratic administration, really doesn't happen very much when you have justices who have policy preferences that include a strong executive. Okay? So Trump was just a case in a line of cases where the court says, we like the president and we like him, someday her, to have a lot of power. Okay? So Trump is the first case. The second is South Dakota versus Wayfair. Funny, because we've got a big package from Wayfair sitting in our garage right now that I need to do something with in the coming days, or we have to do something with. And this case is about taxing online goods. And here the court simply says that states may now begin to collect taxes on businesses that do not reside within the state. The prevailing precedent had been that you had to have a physical presence. And the court has finally said, look, almost everything that we do commerce-wise today takes place in the cloud. And it makes no sense to not allow or not well, I guess allow is the word, states to tax outside entities in the same way that they tax intrastate entities. It is simply fair. So that actually, while seemed to be salient and somewhat controversial, really comes down to a policy decision on how states treat businesses. And it's difficult in this case because, in fact, the Roberts Court is also, in a large sense, a very pro-business court. And in this sense, they actually, in this case, they rule for the state. Which, interestingly enough, when I bandy around these terms, and I'm very careful with my students, and I know some of them, or a couple of them are here tonight, it is difficult to bandy around the terms liberal and conservative, because I use them in many ways. When you're talking about, and this is just an aside, when you're talking about civil liberties cases, think about the salient ones: abortion rights, voting rights, death penalty, those sorts of things. A liberal decision is one that is in favor of individual rights. Anytime you can look at a case and say the court increased individual rights, that's a liberal decision. If it decreases individual rights, that's a conservative decision. In economics cases, it's different. When the court rules in favor of the government in economic cases like in Wayfair, that's the liberal decision. Ruling in favor of business interests is considered the conservative decision. And then I will bandy about the terms liberal and conservative in one additional way, and that is in a judicial way. Are judges conservative judicially or liberal judicially? A conservative justice judicially is one who will defer to the elected branches more often than not. You've heard the terms activists and restrainists. An activist judge is one who is willing to overturn acts of Congress or states or city governments. A restrainist judge, a more conservative justice judicially, will say, no, I defer to the elected branches more often than not. So be very careful, I think, is why I went off on this tangent, when you hear the terms liberal and conservative, because they mean different things in different contexts. Okay? Third case. Janus. Janus was a massive blow to public unions, and the court did something that it does not like to do. It overturned more than 40 years of precedent that suggested that public unions can indeed ask their members to pay dues, and in fact force members to pay dues. The court actually, in that case, had a compromise. There was a compromise that was forwarded by a former Solicitor General who had worked in the Reagan administration. And his compromise in his amicus brief was, why don't you simply cut the dues where they ought to be? Any dues that would go towards political activity, you cannot force workers to pay. But any dues that go towards things like bargaining, negotiating new contracts, everybody could be forced to pay. The court didn't bite on that argument. And it essentially stripped the ability of public unions to force any workers to pay dues. Time will tell policy-wise the effect that this will have on unions. And I have friends who belong to various unions, from teachers' unions to other groups, and they don't know yet either. They simply don't know what the effect will be. But Janus might have been the single most important decision that the court handed down, and the one that will have the biggest effect policy-wise last term. Two last ones. Cell phones have become a very big deal, obviously. Carpenter versus the United States, the court says, in fact, in a very liberal decision for a very ideologically conservative Roberts court, the court says, in fact, if you are going to look at someone's phone to determine where they are going or to determine what might be on their phone, you must have a warrant. Now, the interesting thing about Carpenter is that this is a case that former Justice Scalia probably would have been in the majority on. Justice Scalia absolutely positively has the moniker of being one of, if not the most ideologically conservative justice ever to sit on the bench, with the exception of Fourth Amendment cases, where he actually, on a fairly regular basis, oddly enough, ruled with the criminally accused on a regular basis. This is a case that Scalia would have ruled with Carpenter. I can almost guarantee it given what he's written in the past. But Carpenter really does protect that computer that we all carry in our pockets or in our purses now in even stronger ways than the court had done in the past. Finally, I guess I do have two last cases, because the other important case from last term was Masterpiece Cake Shop. And that is the case about whether or not you can force a cake baker to make cakes for people who are marrying someone of the same sex. The court punted in this case in some sense. If you listen to any commentary from most mainstream media, what you heard was this was a blow to the rights of same-sex couples. And of course it was. But what the court said in this case was, we will actually not deal with the issue of whether this isn't a problem for same-sex couples. What we are dealing with in this case is how a particular council, in this case the Colorado Civil Rights Commission, dealt with the issue that was brought to them by the cake maker. And the court simply said, through all of its opinion, bottom line, the Civil Rights Commission in Colorado didn't act properly because they were saying discriminatory, biased things against this particular cake maker. That case may not have fundamentally been fully different had a couple of members of that Civil Rights Commission not said biased things during the hearings, but it is likely it would have been somewhat different. And I will refer you to a case from the early 90s that is very similar, and it is, for my students here, they've heard me say this, my single favorite case name of all time from the US Supreme Court, 1997. The Church of the Lukumi Babalu versus the City of Hialeah, Florida. It's a mouthful, but it's a great case name. The Lukumi Babalu are a group who came from Haiti, half Catholic, half Santeria religion. And they move into the city of Hialeah, and I kid you not, in a room very similar to this in Edina, Minnesota, you had city council members sitting up here, and you heard things, and you can Google this and find it in the transcript. Oh my God. These people are moving into our town. They are going to bring their voodoo with them. They are going to bring animal sacrifice. We have to do everything in our power to get them out. So the one thing that they did in the city of Hialeah, Florida, is they passed a law that said the only people who can butcher animals are licensed butchers. You or I couldn't butcher an animal in a religious ceremony. The case actually goes all the way, obviously, to the Supreme Court. In a 9-0 decision, which included Justice Scalia, the justices said, there is no way we can rule in favor of the city. All you need to do is read the transcript of what the city council said. And they admitted straight up they were going to discriminate against this religious group. It's the same thing that happened in Masterpiece Cake Shop. The court simply said, if you look at the transcript of what happened in the commission, the Civil Rights Commission, they were discriminating against the cake shop right away and never gave him a chance. My point is this, the court backed off and punted on the issue of whether this could be done more generally to same-sex couples. That case will come to the court. And it will come probably fairly soon. And especially with the change in ideology on the court, it's going to be interesting to see what will happen. I think people can make pretty good predictions, although I generally don't make them publicly. Last case involved Minnesota. And it's one that could get some play here in the next 4 weeks. The case was called Minnesota Voters Alliance versus Mansky. And the long and the short of the case is, can you wear political paraphernalia into the polling place? And Minnesota has said you can't. And in fact, gentlemen sitting here with the Gopher sweatshirt on, there are people in the United States, around the US, who had been accused of that being a political shirt. Not the University of Minnesota, but other universities. That might be political because you are pushing an agenda when you walk into the polling place. Yeah, exactly. Minnesota lost that case. This was a liberal decision for the Roberts Court. And the court did say there might be some limits on what you can wear into a polling place. But those limits should not be you can't wear anything that could be construed as political. The issue in that case was a gentleman who walked in with a t-shirt that said, ID me. someone who was in favor of voter ID. And he was kicked out of the polling place, rightfully so, because of the Minnesota law. And the court said, you can't do that. Now, the interesting argument that was made in favor of trying to uphold the Minnesota law was that in a case called Burson versus Freeman from about 25 or 30 years ago, the court did uphold restrictions on campaigning outside of polling places. Now it's like a 100-yard restriction for 500 feet. I forget what the exact distance is. And the court said that's reasonable. You can't be walking to the polling place and have you start trying to talk to me and tell me who to vote for. I'm going to the polling place. You need to leave me alone. But what the court said is very similar to the famous case that you've probably heard about or read in your history books, Tinker versus Des Moines. When you have silent speech, and that sweatshirt that says Minnesota on it is silent speech. That's not something that we restrict in the United States, even in a polling place. The court left the door open a little bit for whether or not there could be some restrictions in the future, but by and large, you actually now can wear almost anything you want into the polling places. You probably at least need to wear clothes. Okay? So that's a very quick and dirty overview of the major cases from last term. I will say one thing, and the reason I ended with Mansky, is that this court, the Roberts Court again, has been a huge friend of the First Amendment and the free speech clause of the First Amendment in particular. And while the court has done some things to expand freedom of speech rights in ways that make people sort of turn their heads sometimes, that is, give freedom of speech rights to corporations, which has been a topic of major debate throughout the Roberts Court has shown it is most liberal when it comes to speech rights. That is expanding our ability to have that right protected in the United States. Okay, that's 2017. I'll take any questions on that, and any of those cases or others if you want. As I said, nothing happening right now at the court. Two cases that I would consider semi-major. Okay, one is called Weaver Hauser Company versus the U.S. Wildlife Service. And the reason this might be important is that it is one of the first times in a very long time that the court has dealt with the Endangered Species Act. And this case is interesting because the particular development in question in this case is actually not a development that is being built on land that actually is a habitat for the particular animal in question. It's a type of frog. But it could be a habitat that the frog could live in. And so the question is, can the Wildlife Service, the Fish and Game Service, ban development on a plot of land that could potentially in the future be a habitat for a particular animal? Again, I don't make public predictions, and sadly I'm on camera here, so I will try to be light about this. I can't imagine the government winning this case. I won't predict whether it will or not, but I just can't imagine. This is not a court at this time that's willing to deal in might be. Okay? So that's one. The second is actually a death penalty case. Death penalty cases are always quite salient for obvious reasons. But the court very quietly has docketed a case, Madison versus Alabama. And this case in particular is about whether or not we should continue to put to death people on death row who no longer remember the crime that they committed. That is, you are so deep in the throes of dementia, so deep in the throes of Alzheimer's disease, that putting you to death might not mean anything. And should a state still be able to do that? It is anybody's guess how this court will come down. I would suspect that if Justice Kennedy were still on the court, that Madison would probably win this case, but in now, all bets are off. But that is the only other semi-salient case that the court has docketed. And I'll reiterate the reason. The justices do not like to put major, highly salient cases on their docket when there's only 8 of them there. They don't believe it is in the best interest of the court and its legitimacy and its power to decide cases without a full complement of justices. And we've seen that happen in 69 into 70 into 71 when Justices Black and Douglas were sick on a regular basis and in the hospital on a regular basis, the court was down to 7 for several sittings during that time, and more than several sittings during that time. Again, when Justice Marshall was sick on a regular basis in 79 into the early 80s, when Justice Powell was sick in the mid-1980s before he retired in 1987, and even when Justice Rehnquist was out somewhat in 03, 04 with throat cancer, the court was trying to defer and keep away from cases that it could make a major splash with. Okay? So that's it on the 2018 term, because there's, honest to God, not much else to say about it yet. So that brings us to the topic, and that is Judge Kavanaugh. Now let me begin, before I talk about Judge Kavanaugh, by talking about Justice Kennedy. Political scientists have deemed certain nominations to the US Supreme Court critical nominations. And not critical in any partisan sense or critical in any ideological sense, but critical because those nominations change the makeup of the court fundamentally. In 1986, when Chief Justice Burger, at the end of the 85 term into 86, when Chief Justice Burger retired, President Reagan elevated Justice Rehnquist. Not much to yell about. You're replacing a conservative with a conservative. So then they elevate, or they don't elevate, he nominates Justice Scalia to replace Justice Rehnquist. I mean, what do we care? Right? Justice Scalia dies, and we replace him with Justice Gorsuch. Not a big deal, because you're really trading ideologically 1 for 1, no big change in the court. But when Lewis Powell leaves the bench in 1987, the Democrats decided to stand their ground. And that's the Robert Bork hearing. And the reason that that was a critical election, or a critical nomination, was that Lewis Powell sat at the center of the court in almost every term from 1971 to 1987. And it depended on the specific issue area, but by and large, while he was right-leaning, he sat at the center of the court. And when Robert Bork was nominated, he was going to be the single most ideologically conservative justice in the history of the United States Supreme Court. And you're replacing a moderate with an extreme member of what we call one of the wings, in this case, the right wing of the bench. And the Democrats weren't going to stand for that. In fact, interest groups weren't going to stand for it, and they fought tooth and nail. They spent hundreds of thousands and millions of dollars to fight the Bork nomination. And you heard, if you watched last week, Justice Kavanaugh use the verb that we now use in court parlance. He said, "I will not be borked." And Robert Bork thought he himself was borked. If you read his book, The Tempting of America, he blames the Democrats, but more specifically, he blames liberal interest groups, beginning with the ACLU, for what happened to him. That's why they fought so hard. Had Bork been replacing Rehnquist or Burger, Robert Bork probably would have been on the US Supreme Court. So he is denied. He's not confirmed. He's rejected by the Senate. So President Reagan puts up a second nominee, and it's interesting, especially given that the Kavanaugh hearings have been largely about drinking beer. Doug Ginsburg, who was a law professor at Harvard, actually pulled his nomination. He never had a vote. He pulled his nomination because it came out that he smoked pot with his students at Harvard Law. And that was enough to not even get him a vote. He simply pulled back because he knew that smoking pot in 1987 would have killed his nomination. And so what did we get? We got what Harry Blackmun called not only himself, but then Justice Kennedy, old number 3, meaning the third choice. Harry Blackmun was Nixon's third choice, after 2 were ejected by the Senate. And so Kennedy and Blackmun always had a particular kinship with one another because they were the third choice, and that might make you feel not so powerful sometimes, right? But Kennedy is that third choice. He's a moderate choice. There's a really good book that you should read called Closed Chambers. A former clerk of Justice Blackmun's wrote Closed Chambers. And if you buy his argument, and I think he's got a good case for his argument, Kennedy was vilified by the right immediately because he wasn't conservative enough. And let me make the case for this. There's 9 justices on the bench, right? So one of the things we know is that chief justices get to assign who writes majority opinions. And one of the main factors is they want equity. They don't want you writing every opinion or you writing every opinion. They want everyone to have some homework. Okay? So 9 out of 100%, everyone gets about 11% of the opinion assignments. And that's actually pretty accurate across the history of the court, at least post-World War II. So stick with me. In general, you should expect every justice to write about 11% of the opinions a term. Here's what Justice Kennedy did. He did write 11% of every opinion during his tenure that we would label conservative. 11% of every conservative opinion. And in fact, Antonin Scalia wrote the most conservative opinions. That makes sense. But Kennedy wrote more conservative opinions than Rehnquist and Clarence Thomas, although they were close. On the other hand, Kennedy wrote 11% of every liberal decision handed down by the court during his tenure. Only John Paul Stevens wrote more, and Kennedy wrote more than Ginsburg and Stephen Breyer, although again, like the conservatives, they were close. My point is, he sat right at the center, both sides played with him. And he wrote essentially more opinions on average than any of the most conservative or most liberal justices on the bench. Okay? He was at the center of some of the most conservative decisions of the last part of the 20th century, early 21st, and the most liberal. So let me talk about the conservative ones quickly. He was a vote in favor of killing Obamacare constitutionally. He was a key vote in Heller to uphold Second Amendment rights. He was the vote in Janus to put the kibosh, that's a technical term, on public unions. He wrote Citizens United. And while he was on the side of increasing or at least upholding abortion rights for women, he drew a very strong line in the sand on late-term abortions. And so in those last, what I would call real restrictions on abortion rights, the late-term abortion cases from the early aughts, Kennedy was in the majority. But listen to what he did in the liberal direction. He increased the rights of same-sex couples. He protected the rights of same-sex couples. Lawrence v. Texas, he wrote, and said the police can no longer, or the state can no longer go in and enforce state sodomy laws only against same-sex couples and not against heterosexual couples. He wrote the decision in Obergefell, upholding the right of same-sex couples to marry. He refused to overturn Roe versus Wade in Planned Parenthood versus Casey. There's a famous note that he wrote to Harry Blackmun in his own handwriting that I've got a digital image of, and it says, almost verbatim, "Dear Harry, when you've got a minute, I need to see you. I need to talk to you about Casey. Most of what I will say to you will be good news to your ears." When Blackmun thought that Roe was dead in 1992. Kennedy was on the side of increasing or giving the right to petition for habeas corpus to Guantanamo Bay detainees during the War on Terror. He wrote the opinion in Lee versus Weissman, I think he wrote the opinion in Lee versus Weissman, that banned school prayers at graduation ceremonies to protect the rights of those who did not want those prayers to be read because it was not part of their religion or it made them feel uncomfortable. And finally, he was very clear at helping increase due process rights for juvenile defendants. What's my point? Kennedy sits at the middle. He goes right a decent amount of times in some highly important, highly influential cases, goes left in other cases, highly influential, increasing civil liberties and civil rights. That's who left the bench. And he was much stronger than Lewis Powell in that middle position. He was not quite as strong as Sandra Day O'Connor in that middle position. But when she left, he did take over for her at the center of the court. Last piece of data I'll throw at you. In 20 of the 31 terms that he sat on the US Supreme Court, he led or tied his colleagues in the number of 5-4 decisions in which he was in the majority. 20 out of his 31 terms, he was in the majority in 5-4 decisions more often than any of his other colleagues. That's the definition of a swing justice. And what's going to happen? On Saturday morning, presumably, depending on 1 or 2 votes now, Judge Kavanaugh will become Justice Kavanaugh. And by all accounts of the data that we have, he sits closer to Justice Thomas ideologically than to Chief Justice Roberts. And instantaneously, Chief Justice Roberts becomes the median justice on the US Supreme Court. That is not good news for the liberal side of things. It is very good news for the conservative side of things, ideologically speaking in this case. And it is going to be very interesting to see what Chief Justice Roberts does. Because one thing that chiefs have that is not in common with their colleagues on the bench is that the court is named after them. Right? This is the Roberts Court era. The other thing they don't have in common is that chiefs care like presidents like hell about their legacy. And one of the reasons that I have spun, and I think I'm right on this, I think I'm right about most things, and most things I'm really not, but this one I think I'm right on, is a key reason the chief voted to uphold Obamacare was that he was not going to go down in history as his court era killing healthcare rights for Americans. It bought him a lot of political capital. It allowed him to write a pretty snarky dissent in Obergefell and in some other highly salient cases where he wanted to push things farther right. All of this rests on his shoulders. Will he want the court to turn to be more conservative than the most conservative court we've ever had, and that was the Rehnquist court probably from 94 to 05? Or is he going to try to moderate the court to uphold some semblance of legitimacy when every other part of our federal government is fighting partisan-wise and ideological-wise with one another? Time will tell. But Judge and ultimately Justice Kavanaugh, if it comes to that, will change this court forever. Because as I said to some of my students in this room, when you turn 70, he could still be on the bench. It is not inconceivable that Judge Kavanaugh could be bitter enough about what has happened that he says at 95 years old, or 97 I guess it would be, I still want to be on the bench. Probably not, so let's say 40 years. At 87, I'll still be on the bench. Justice Thomas went before the cameras after everything that happened in 1991 with Anita Hill. And he stood in front of the cameras and he said, all you liberal interest groups that fought against me, get used to it because I'm not going anywhere. And I can almost guarantee you that if and when he is confirmed, Judge Kavanaugh will say the same thing. Now, interestingly enough, you all came in here, I don't know how many of you were on your phones. An hour and 10 minutes ago, Judge Kavanaugh published an editorial in the Wall Street Journal apologizing for being too emotional and too angry at the confirmation hearings. Never in the history of the US Supreme Court has a nominee done an on-camera interview, which he did last week, or published an editorial of this manner. Now, justices have spoken out Justice Ginsburg has said some things about President Trump, and then she pulled back and will never speak that way again because she realized she probably shouldn't have done so. When you get off the bench, justices can and do get mouthy. Probably the favorite thing a former justice has ever said. Justice Marshall leaves, President Bush replaces him with Justice Thomas, and a reporter asks Thurgood Marshall, what do you think of President Bush's choice? And this is true. You can Google this as well. Thurgood Marshall said, I was always taught not to speak ill of the dead, and President Bush is dead to me. Now, he was off the bench. So you might expect that, and you might expect that from someone of his maturity, well, his age, and his stature, and someone who saw a seat that he had turned over to someone that he was fundamentally opposed to. He would not have said that if he was still on the bench. And that's why Justice Ginsburg has stopped talking about President Bush, okay? But all I can say is this, and then I'll stop so we have at least 45 minutes for questions. The court has changed fundamentally and will change in a way that it has not changed in a very long time. This would be a completely different court if Merrick Garland were on it. And then this particular nomination wouldn't mean so much, but it does. When you put that in the context of the partisanship of Washington, D.C. today, it is no wonder we had happened what happened. Someone asked me prior to coming in about the notion, we were talking about the notion that we can't talk to people who don't believe what we believe in anymore. And that's true. Members of Congress used to beat the living daylights out of each other in the well of the Senate or the House, and then they'd go have a drink. And today, if I disagree with you, or I disagree with you, I have to hate you. And the Kavanaugh nomination is in that context. And I'm telling you, it ain't going to get better until someone stands up. And I'll say this, I don't care if you agree with Heidi Heitkamp or not, senator from North Dakota, but she said, if you've read her statement, she's voting her conscience, and she's going to lose her seat because of it. And again, I don't care if you agree with her or not, but we don't, in the end, have enough politicians in Washington, D.C. anymore who are willing to vote their conscience and then suffer the consequences. And that's on both sides of the aisle. Okay? All right, that's my little bit standing on my soapbox about Washington, D.C. But I can tell you this, and then I'll be quiet. The cloture vote is tomorrow. That then sets up a 30-hour waiting period before they can actually vote. Senator Collins came out and said she thought the FBI investigation was thorough. I don't know what that means. It was interesting. I was also telling someone beforehand that my wife and I were at one of our boys' soccer games right before this, and I got a call. And this is not to talk about how great I am, but it's to talk about what actually happened on the phone. I got a call from some reporter, and she said, I'm sorry if I'm not typing very quickly. I'm on my phone. And I said, oh, where are you? She said, I'm on my cell phone outside of Senator Collins' office, and I'm hoping she comes out this door. So if I hang up on you immediately, you'll know why I hung up on you. And she didn't hang up on me, and I never heard back from her whether Senator Collins came out. But Collins, Murkowski, and I didn't know this. My wife knew this, and I didn't. Apparently, Murkowski's having difficulty getting flights from Alaska. She is home. She's in district. Senator, and then I'll be quiet, I promise. Senator Daines from Montana is not going to be there for the vote on Saturday. His wife is getting married. He is walking her down the aisle. He just reported to the AP about 2 hours ago.
His daughter?
I'm sorry? Or his daughter. I'm sorry. Wow. His daughter. I will say this. I apologize, but I have a lot of medication in me. I'm sporting a really big cold, so thank you for correcting me. His daughter is walking down the aisle, and he's going to be the one to walk her down the aisle, so he's not going to be there to vote. So they're down one vote, although his comment was he's very confident that the confirmation will happen without him. That is telling as well for a Murkowski and a Collins and a Flake and a Manchin. So we'll see. But I fully expect on Monday there will be 9 members at oral argument. That's my best guess. Okay, on that note, I'll be quiet and I will take any and all questions that you might have.
And I have some here. Thank you very much for handing these in. One of them says, how can the Republicans, could be Congress, get away with not even giving Merrick Garland a decent hearing? Why did this happen?
Yep. It's a great question. Whether or not you like Mitch McConnell, and I say this to my students, I could care less what your politics are. Whether or not you like Mitch McConnell, single most brilliant political move in the history of Congress. Why? Because the majority leader in the Senate holds all the cards. He holds all the power as to what comes to the floor and what doesn't come to the floor. That's why when Senator Flake last week said, look, I'm going to vote to send Kavanaugh to the floor, but with the proviso that I'm really probably going to vote no if there's not an additional FBI investigation. McConnell didn't need to listen to that, but it would have been a calculated risk because I almost guarantee you that Flake, Murkowski, and Collins would have been no votes had they not done even the 3.5-day investigation or 4-day investigation that they did. They got away with it because they can. That's how Senate rules work. And they simply didn't allow, in between Senator McConnell and Senator Grassley, they didn't allow because they didn't schedule any hearings. And then they didn't bring it up for a vote. There was nothing to be done. Nothing to be done. And I'll say this, and this is not me and my soapbox, this isn't a partisan comment either. As a political scientist, I laugh on a regular basis when I hear the President of the United States blame the Democrats in Congress. There's nothing to blame them for. They're the minority party. And if the Democrats were a little gutsier, they would start saying that. They simply didn't have the votes to do anything about Merrick Garland. And it's horrible, and they're going to be angry forever, and that has led to the fight over Kavanaugh and a slight fight over Gorsuch. But in the end, McConnell held all the cards. Simple as that.
Okay. What does it mean that a justice like Kennedy decides to retire when he does? He could have waited until after the midterms.
Yeah, it is unclear why he took this particular path with this particular timing. In 2000, and I think the Kavanaugh hearings are going to be very similar to Bush versus Gore in this sense, and I will never put them on a 9/11 or the Kennedy assassination, but they're on the level of you will always know where you were. If you were sitting and watching Professor Blasey Ford, or you were listening to Judge Kavanaugh, you will always remember. This is a humongous, salient moment in U.S. politics. Bush versus Gore. They initially announced that Al Gore has won the election, those of you who remember 2000. Al Gore was declared the victor. And there is ample evidence, actually mostly from a Newsweek reporter, who was standing at a cocktail party with Sandra Day O'Connor and others, but was behind Justice O'Connor, and she uttered the words, "Oh my, this is terrible," because she wanted to retire. And she didn't want Al Gore to replace her. Here's the irony of that. By the time she left in 2005, she actually didn't want Bush 43 to replace her. Okay? I think that Justice Kennedy decided it was time. There is evidence that he has been having health issues. There is evidence that there may have been some, and I know that this is on public TV and I'm not holding the evidence, but there are several papers that have been floating around that have suggested that he may have been starting into the throes of at least the initial stages of dementia. And so for health, if your health has gone to a certain level, you're going to leave. And he might not have been able to help it. So let me compare him again to Thurgood Marshall. And I like to talk about Thurgood Marshall a lot because we named one of our sons after him. My wife, again, smarter than me, would not let us name him Thurgood. She thought that might not do well for him on the playground. So his middle name is Marshall. So I was able to sneak Thurgood Marshall into there. President Carter was the unluckiest president of the 20th century because, on average, a president gets a nominee to the Supreme Court every 2 years. If you add up the number of years that the court has been in existence and you add up the number of justices, it's one every 2 years. Carter got 0. And they were fearful that they were going to have 0, and they also knew that Thurgood Marshall was sick. He'd been missing a lot of oral arguments. He wasn't on the bench a lot, was not doing well in 1978 into 79. So the Carter administration went to him and said, leave. Come on, retire. We got people we can replace you with, good liberals that we can get on the bench. And Thurgood Marshall said, over my dead body, essentially, right? I will be carried out dead. I'm not leaving. What happened was that Marshall overplayed his cards, because when it got to 1991 and he is so sick that he can't function anymore, he had to leave. And he left under Bush, and it was replaced with Clarence Thomas. So I think Kennedy, probably being a good conservative and a good team player, simply said this was time. I would suspect that it was not good timing. I would argue it might not be good timing for the court's legitimacy and for Congress's, the Senate's legitimacy, because of what happened to Merrick Garland. That maybe he could have waited and seen what happened. No. And I'll add, in case someone asked this question and you can skip it, let's play the scenario out that the Democrats win the Senate on November 6th. And it's not going to happen, but let's just pretend. The lame duck Republican Senate would still confirm someone if Kavanaugh was denied. They would get him through in 2 months. Again, nothing the minority can do anymore, because the filibuster is gone for Supreme Court nominees. It's gone for lower federal court judges. The only thing the Democrats could do would be to try to get the floor and filibuster for 2 months. And again, Senator McConnell, Majority Leader, would never bring another bill up in those 2 months. He would shut down the Senate, and the only issue would be the new nominee to replace the Kavanaugh nominee. So the Democrats are going to lose this no matter what happens, unless something catastrophic happened in the Senate, and that's not going to happen.
Thank you. Ideally, the court should be apolitical. Has there ever been an environment like this?
Oh yeah. Early on, days of yore, the John Marshall Court. And the only reason the Marshall Court wasn't as nasty as things are now, ideologically and partisan-wise, because they certainly were. My students push back on me all the time when I say this, but I swear to you that this is accurate. The partisanship that we have today, in some sense, pales in comparison to the Federalists and Anti-Federalists wanting to kill each other. The reason the court isn't as messy then as it is now is that John Marshall ruled the court with an iron fist. It was his court. The reason we name courts by the Chief Justice, the eras, is we began with Marshall. It was the Marshall Court. And it was, in every sense, the Marshall Court. Marbury versus Madison, McCulloch versus Maryland, two of the most famous decisions that the court has ever handed down, and the two most important decisions probably from the Marshall Court. There is ample evidence to suggest that John Marshall wrote those opinions actually a couple of months before the court even heard oral arguments in those cases, because he knew the decision he wanted, and he knew he could force his colleagues to sign the opinions. So there have been these fights. There were fights in Reconstruction, during Reconstruction. There were fights during the Industrial Revolution, and then the other massive fight that we had was over the New Deal. I mean, we don't name our justices this anymore, but we had, during the New Deal, the four horsemen of the apocalypse on the US Supreme Court. We literally called them the four horsemen of the apocalypse, fighting FDR. And James McReynolds, who was one of the four horsemen, who was, you should read about him, one of the most unsavory characters ever to sit on the US Supreme Court. An anti-Semite, he was anti-women, anti-Catholic, he was racist, he was just not a good human being. And he was also anti-people with disabilities. And not only did he fight tooth and nail every one of FDR's New Deal pieces of legislation, but he was never going to leave the bench. And the takeaway quote from McReynolds was, "I will never retire from the bench as long as that crippled son of a bitch is still in the White House." And can you imagine a Supreme Court justice saying that today? Well, I don't. Maybe not with our news, not with our 27 news media and social media. Maybe. That was pretty ugly. That was pretty ugly. So yes, we have experienced this before. We've never experienced it. We're sitting at dinner, and before we came over here, and I was on Twitter, and my wife finally said, Julie finally said, you got to stop reading everything. You just have to stop. And that's the thing, is it is hard to stop. It is in our face 24/7. So he could say this, make this derogatory statement about someone who's in a wheelchair in the West Wing running the country. Who's going to hear about it? Maybe for the first day or two, or maybe week. Today you say boo, and it's heard in China. Well, yeah, actually, what I know, enough people would hear about it in China. So we've had this before. We've never had it where it is in our face all the time. That's the problem. And we have people who are hiding behind their computers, who are rabble-rousing. What did I hear someone call them? Keyboard bandits, keyboard junkies, something like that, where you can just be anonymous and stir up stuff. That has not, we haven't lived in this type of era where you can do that on a regular basis and everybody sees it. So.
This is asking you for a prediction. When do you think the next seat will open up?
Not before 2020. And that's barring death. I mean, look, right. I'll tell you the story of my bizarre story of Justice Scalia dying. We were on a date for Valentine's Day with another couple. And I'm driving. We were going out to Minnetrista to a farm, which was ridiculously dumb because it was like -8 degrees outside. And we were having a gourmet dinner at this farm and then going on a sleigh ride. I don't know why we decided to do this when it was that cold out. And honestly, I've never had this happen before. My phone was blowing up. And so I finally got it out of my pocket and handed it to my wife. And she, oh my God, Justice Scalia died. And I spent the first hour of that date. They were all drinking. I was over in like the ante room because I just was talking to every reporter who could get a hold of me. And finally, not my wife and not our friends, one of the waitresses came up and said, maybe you should like go back now. And I did, right? I was good. I went back to the date. But the point of that is it can happen unexpectedly. So, right, I'm sure that question was someone asking about Ruth Bader Ginsburg. I mean, if you've seen the Colbert episode, if you've read her book, she is doing everything in her power to stay as healthy as humanly possible. So, my prediction, if I were to make one and I'm not, is there will not be another opening prior to 2020.
Thank you. If this is a court that's friendly to executive power, is it possible to become less friendly to executive power if and when the court no longer likes the executive in power?
Well, and that's why I added the caveat that this court, except for a few issues, was relatively good to President Obama as well. Yeah, I mean, the court can always retrench, can always pull back on a particular issue, and you're going to get courts that are more or less into executive power. The court that was most in favor of executive power in the history of the U.S. Supreme Court was the Taft Court. Why? Because he had been president, and he loved executive power. Even though his dream job was to be chief, and he became that, he was able to still throw a bunch of power back the executive's way. Yeah, the court can absolutely change. But if you have a bunch of judicial conservatives on the bench, and judicial conservatives can be ideologically liberal or ideologically conservative, doesn't just happen one direction, then of course they can pull back. And if you get a majority of judicial conservatives on the bench, they're always going to want to defer to the elected branches more often than not, and that includes the president.
Is it important for the Supreme Court to have unanimous decisions or on significant issues rather than 5-4 decisions?
So there is really good evidence. I've got friends who've done this research that policy-wise, we are more likely to follow decisions as the public, as the citizenry, that are 9-0 decisions. But that effect actually dissipates over time. Right, so you get a really dicey decision in Planned Parenthood versus Casey, which wasn't even a 5-4. It was like a 3-3-3 decision in the end. No, it didn't even have a majority in Casey. There were 3 in the middle, which ruled the case, which were Kennedy, Souter, and O'Connor. And then you had the folks on the left, which were Blackmun, Stevens, and I'll have to think about who it was. And then you had Rehnquist, Scalia, Thomas on the right. That was a mess of a decision because you couldn't even get a majority. We all know now that the standard set out in Casey is the law of the land that we follow on abortion rights for women. So the effect does dissipate over time. But I believe that the justices believe that getting to unanimity is more important than not. And I'll tell you an anecdote of one of the court's most important cases in its history, and that's Brown versus the Board of Education. Brown was argued initially in 1952, and then Chief Justice Vinson died. So Vinson dies, the court is sort of in disarray because there's all sorts of big-time cases, but Brown is the case. So Eisenhower puts on Earl Warren. He's, of course, a Republican from California, so it's unclear what's going to happen. He asks to have Brown re-argued. Brown is argued then again in 53 and ultimately decided in 54. And Earl Warren, very similar to John Marshall, said, "We will not hand down Brown unless it's a 9-0. The only way we're going to be taken seriously to say we're going to integrate schools racially is if we speak as a court, not as 9 individuals." Every single desegregation case from 53 to 69 during the Warren court era was unanimous because Earl Warren fundamentally believed, and his colleagues agreed, they had to speak as the court. So the first desegregation case comes up in the Berger court. And policy-wise, Brown v. the Board of Education says, right, we are going to desegregate schools, this is the famous phrase, with all deliberate speed. Most schools in the United States, many schools in the North, almost every school in the South took all deliberate speed to mean, we'll get around to it. So by 1969, there was like 8% of schools that were fully integrated. And Brown had been decided in 1954. So the court actually gets a case that comes out of Mississippi. Warren is gone. I always get this screwed up, right? Because it's Earl Warren and then Warren Burger replaces him. Warren Burger comes on, and Burger, even more than any Chief Justice that I've ever studied, was really freaked out about what history would say about him. He was really insecure. And he says, I have to, at a minimum, do what Warren did. And this case has to be unanimous. Well, Thurgood Marshall and Bill Douglas and Hugo Black went to him and said, we're all going to dissent. And we're going to dissent unless you strike that damn phrase with all deliberate speed out of Brown and tell all Southern schools to desegregate immediately. And Burger freaked out. One, because it was going to be almost impossible in June to say that every school has to desegregate by September 1st. Like, policy-wise, that's going to be pretty difficult to do. But he also freaked out because he thought he was going to go down in history as the worst Chief Justice ever because he couldn't coalesce a court the way Burger did, or the way Warren did. So they let Burger hang and hang and hang, and then they finally compromised. They compromised and said, we will force schools to integrate as quickly as humanly possible, and we will get rid of that phraseology from Brown versus the Board of Education, and Burger was able to secure a 9-0 majority. I'll give you one other example, maybe even more important because of what it was going to do to the United States, U.S. versus Nixon. U.S. v. Nixon, hand over the tapes, which, again, if Nixon was brilliant. If he had really been brilliant, he would have burned the tapes and they wouldn't have existed. But he didn't. They still existed. So they get all the way to the Supreme Court, and the court what are we going to do? Well, imagine in 1974 if it had been a 5-4 and William Brennan or Thurgood Marshall wrote the opinion. Just think how Nixon would have responded. Oh my God, these two liberals telling me to hand over the tapes? It's a conspiracy. I'm not going to do it. But you know what happened? It was a 9-0 decision, and Chief Justice Burger signed his name to the opinion, the Chief Justice whom Nixon had nominated to the bench. And what's Nixon going to say when his chief, with 8 backing him, say, hand over the tapes? So the point of both Brown and Nixon is that, yes, they strive for 9-0 decisions. The 5-4s the court hands down are actually getting smaller and smaller. They're the ones we all fight about. But the court still hands down the modal category, meaning the most. The modal category are 8 1s and 9 0s put together, because most cases are easy. It's those difficult ones that deal with the issues that we fight about that get us to those 5-4s.
Can you speculate on the effect on the Supreme Court and its decisions when it becomes clear that the American people no longer view the court and its decisions as legitimate?
Yeah, sadly, well, not sadly. Sadly for that questioner, we still think the court is the most legitimate institution we've got. We just do. And so we measure the way people think about the court in a number of ways, but the 2 broad categories are specific support and diffuse support. Specific support is whether or not you like an opinion. Do you like what the court did in Bush versus Gore? If I had a whiteboard up here, I would draw for you, and you could laugh at me because my art skills are horrible. But imagine an X and Y axis, and imagine the Y axis 0 to 100%, and imagine between 65 and 70. That's where the court runs. And it's dipped some now, but in general, the court sits between 65 and 75% with some variation. After Bush v. Gore, December 11th, December 12th of 2000, the court takes this massive dip. And by massive, I mean like 12 to 15 to 18%, depending on what poll you're reading at the time. And so let's just equate public opinion about the court right now with legitimacy, which is not exactly accurate, but it'll do for the purposes of this point. By April of 2001, you know where the court's public opinion was? Back up to the 65 to 70% range. There were people who were intensely angry about what the court had done in Bush versus Gore, but the court's a lot better than Congress, a lot better than the president, a lot better than our bureaucracy. I mean, that's what people think. The court enjoys a high level of legitimacy. So it will take a hit in individual cases, but its diffuse support stays relatively strong, and it will take measures to protect its diffuse support. Go back to Brown. 54, for the love of goodness gracious, we are telling the entire country that we've got to let little African-American children go to school with little white children. Perish the thought that this is going to happen. In fact, the favorite artifact I have, I just said this in class the other day, I've got an artifact from the mid-1950s. It's a wanted poster of Earl Warren. It's a real poster. It's got coffee stains. It's got the stains from the staple that were on it when it rusted. And it's Earl Warren is wanted for impeachment and laying out all of his offenses. He wants to integrate our schools. He likes communists, all this stuff. So 54, we integrate schools. Perish the thought. 57, the court gets a case that asks it to determine whether we protect the rights of potential communists from naming names in Congress. And the court actually says, yeah, we're going to protect them. Watkins versus the United States. We just talked about it on Tuesday in my common law class. Now the country's really pissed. You're protecting the rights of racial minorities? You're protecting the rights of communists? What kind of country are we living in? The court takes 18 months later, another communist case from the House Un-American Activities Committee, Barenblatt versus the United States, and switches its opinion. And one of the main theories that legal historians and Supreme Court historians have spun about why the court switched, and there's 3 or 4 reasons that I talk about in my class, but one of the main reasons was that the court realized the public was getting angry, Congress was getting angry, state legislatures were getting angry, so we better pull ourselves back to where the public might want us to be a little bit more closely so that people won't be as upset. The court is cognizant, the justices are cognizant of what we think, and it's odd that they would be because we're not their constituents. They're never going to be reelected. They don't need to listen to us, but what they do need is us to listen to it. Because if we don't, all of the court's power goes away. And I'll give you one last example of that. Santa Fe School District had prayers before its football games. It's the late 90s, early 2000s. Someone says this violates separation of church and state, gets the case all the way to the court, and the court says, no more school-sponsored prayers over PA systems before football games or choir concerts or plays. Knock it off. It does violate separation of church and state. And as I say to my students, and this is accurate as well, go to Southwest Minnesota on a Friday night for Friday Night Lights. My wife makes fun of me for this because I love Friday night football under the lights. Or go south of the Mason-Dixon, and you will find at least some schools, if not more than a few, that still have prayers read over their PA system sponsored by the school before those football games. Why? Because unless someone else sues, no one's going to stop them. Those 9, I shouldn't say this about the 40 and 50-somethings, but I will, those 9 old crotchety people in their black robes are not going to go down and stop that prayer. The infamous back and forth in the mythology of U.S. history between President Jackson and John Marshall. And Marshall and his court say no to the Trail of Tears. You're not going to take a bunch of Cherokee Native Americans from Georgia on their great land and march them on foot all the way to the most hideous land we have in the United States, in Oklahoma. Marshall says, And the lore is Jackson's famous phrase, John Marshall has made his decision, let him enforce it. Meaning, you come out here with your white robe and stop my guys with our guns from moving these Native Americans across the country. The court relies on us to buy that it's legitimate. It will take a little bit of a hit. But I'm telling you that after some years, and this is still in debate, for the most part, the court is going to earn back that legitimacy, even if Judge Kavanaugh is confirmed. I think it'll be much harder this time to earn back that legitimacy, but it will have it.
Some pundits are talking about adding justices to the court as a means to rebalance it. Is this realistic?
No. Takes constitutional amendment.
That's what I thought.
You do not want to open up the Constitution to amendments. Well, I mean, maybe you do. You don't want to open up a constitutional convention. We know what happened the last time we had one. They tore up the Articles of Confederation and started a new country, a new government. We probably don't want that. You are not going to get Congress. I don't care who is there. You're not going to get Congress, both houses, by the way, to pass an amendment that would go to the states for ratification. That is the most baldly partisan move that could be made, and that is saying something given what we've experienced in the past week and a half. But think about it this way. FDR won 61% of the popular vote. His party controlled the House, it controlled the Senate, it just didn't control the court, and he was so angry at those 4 horsemen of the apocalypse and the 5th justice who went along with them, a gentleman by the name of Owen Roberts, that he had his plan with his fireside chat that said, I'm the man. I just won the biggest landslide election in the history of the United States. I propose that for every justice over 70 who has spent at least 10 years on the bench, I get a nominee. He was losing every case 5-4. It would have given him 6 nominations. He would have then won every case 10-5 if they had all voted along the ideological direction he wanted them to. His party almost crucified him. It wasn't just the public that was upset. The Democrats in both the House and the House and the Senate were also angry beyond belief. They were not going to let it happen. Luckily, Owen Roberts, and you've heard this phrase and read it in your history book, switched his vote. The switch in time that saved 9. That's what it means. It saved the 9 justices on the bench. No one will stand for putting the number up to 11. Because imagine this. Imagine President Trump loses in 2020. The Democrats who've now taken the House this November 6th, which I think all accounts suggest they will, they take the Senate and they win the White House. And they say, we're going to stop all this nonsense. We're tired of what you did with Merrick Garland. We're tired of what you did with Kavanaugh. We're going to increase the number to 11. We're going to give him 2 more. And then imagine the economy goes to hell. And in 2024, a Republican wins the House, or the White House. The Republicans win the Senate, and they say, now the number's got to be 13. The Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals has 27 justices now. Now, they hear cases in panels of 3. They never sit en banc with all 27. But we're not going to go tit for tat 11, 13, 15, 17, 9. It's just not going to happen. This is a storm that will be weathered, and there will be a switchback. I think the Democrats thought that switchback would be Merrick Garland, and now it's just going to be pushed off into the future at some point, and 5 years, 10 years, 15 years.
Do you see the Supreme Court ever weighing in on political gerrymandering?
So it has. A lot of times the court has weighed in on gerrymandering. It punted the last time with the Wisconsin case. And the reason it did is that the justices said the litigants who sued did not have standing. They were not the proper party to bring the case to the court. And the reason that the justices made this argument was that the lawsuit that emanated from Wisconsin didn't show harm to a particular person in a particular district. The court left the door wide open and said, if you can prove that you've been harmed or you've been harmed or you've been harmed in a particular district, you can sue and we will hear that case. All the way back to Baker versus Carr in 1965, the court has been hearing gerrymandering cases. And it's heard racial gerrymandering cases and partisan gerrymandering cases, and it's going to continue to do so as we have state legislatures controlled by either one of the political parties continue to try to force their party to have the best possible ability to win the most seats in that state. And it's only going to get worse. Because now, right, we generally see, right, the Wisconsin case was a Republican-controlled legislature that did it, but the Democrats have done the same thing in many other states, including in Minnesota from time to time. The fight's not going to stop, meaning the 9 will hear these cases again and again and again.
Thank you. What will it take to overturn Citizens United?
It will take 2 more retirements from the right side of the bench. Hands down, it will take a Democratic president being lucky enough to have Justice Thomas retire and then the Chief Justice retire. Because I don't see Gorsuch, Alito, or Kavanaugh going anywhere anytime soon. But the Chief has had health problems over his career. And Justice Thomas is the 2nd or 3rd oldest justice on the bench now. Literally, that's what it'll take. Two democratically appointed nominees, justices.
What would be the legal basis for reversing existing law? For example, Roe versus Wade.
Yeah. here's the bad thing for advocates of women's right to choose. Roe's a bad decision. It just is. And the reason it's bad, all you need to do is go to Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Justice Ginsburg, when she was a lawyer when Roe was decided, said, not a good decision. Why? Because the right to privacy is so shaky. Because that word isn't in the Constitution. It really comes straight out of Griswold versus Connecticut from 65, 66. And it is easy to beat down. Justice Ginsburg advocated early on that that case should have been an equal protection case. If all the men in this room can decide whether or not to have their appendix out or to do anything else they want with their body, then equal protection clause under the 14th Amendment suggests women have control over their entire body as well. That is a much more difficult argument to break and to stop. In order to overturn precedent, you need no legal basis. You need the most important thing that Justice Brennan thought existed on the court, and that's the number 5. The only thing you need to overturn precedent is 5 votes. Now, we do know this. When a precedent gets old, and by that we mean, depending on who is writing, somewhere over a decade, between 10 and 20 years, most precedents are safe. Most precedents get that old and they get to stay around forever. But the court overturns a famous precedent, Abood, A-B-O-O-D, in the Janus decision from last term. It's a 41, 42-year-old precedent. Why? Because they had 5 votes to do so. And all they need to say is, we think it was wrongly decided. Now, that said, does the court do it lightly? Even in Janus, where the justices had the 5 votes to do it and do it easily, I guarantee you that those 5 didn't do it lightly, meaning they fought hard about it. The justices don't like to overturn precedent. And I always pick on Ginsburg for this joke, and it's only because I think she's easy to pick on at her age. She writes opinions, like all of her colleagues, that say, when we decided Marbury versus Madison. Yeah, I mean, you're old, Justice Ginsburg, but Marbury was 1803 and you weren't in existence back then. Now, the point of the stupid joke is that the justices believe all of those opinions are theirs. There's not a Justice Ginsburg and a Justice Breyer and a Justice Alito and a Chief Justice Roberts. There is the court. And when the court hands down a decision, we, as much as humanly possible, try to uphold that decision. Now, do we strike decisions from time to time? Or do they? Of course they do. Plessy was just a bad decision. Making a policy choice that separate but equal was okay for everybody, wrong. And we decide 60 years later that we've got to overturn it. So there is no legal criteria by which you can overturn a decision. All you need are 5 votes that say we think that is what should be done.
When was the last time the court was deliberately stacked to favor an ideology, political ideology?
Beginning with the Rehnquist court in '86. But of course, from '86 to '91, those first 5 years, you still had the liberal stalwarts in Marshall and Brennan. And when Brennan got too sick in '90 and Marshall got too sick in '91, beginning with Souter in '90 and then Thomas in '91, the court has been stacked. Now, Souter didn't really help stack the court. Souter simply helped Bush 41 not get reelected. He was probably one of the main reasons Bush 41 didn't get reelected, because the right was so angry at how liberal David Souter turned out to be in most, if not all, cases that he wrote in and was in the majority in. So I usually put it about 1994. Even though Ginsburg and Breyer are on there in 93 and 94, you've got the most conservative court you saw in the 20th century, even compared to the Four Horsemen, who they were really just fighting about economic rights. And if we're talking strictly civil liberties and civil rights, Rehnquist, Thomas, Scalia, Kennedy, O'Connor was a pretty good stacking, despite the fact that Kennedy and O'Connor would jump ship every now and again.
Gamble versus the U.S. Can you explain dual sovereignty and double jeopardy?
With 3 minutes left, I will not explain dual sovereignty in any way, shape, or form. I'm not going to go there, but I will explain double jeopardy, and I know the issue is whether or not federal government can actually pursue someone and the state after the states have done so. They're completely different charges, so there's no double jeopardy at hand. So think about the police officers in the Rodney King beating. Right? They were acquitted in state court in California. The federal government swoops in. God, this is double jeopardy. You can't put them on trial again. No, they were trying them for civil rights violations under federal law. And so, yeah, despite the fact that you have this concept of dual sovereignty, because of dual sovereignty, the federal government can prosecute for federal crimes, federal offenses, and not have that violate the idea of double jeopardy, because they're completely different issues. I mean, that's the best I can do in a minute and a half and try to keep it as simple as possible. But the federal government can always do this, and it's been understood that it can do so, and I don't think any court, any Supreme Court in our history would say no to that.
Will the Supreme Court ever change its lifetime appointment and impose term limits?
No. There is no incentive to do it. And again, to go back to the idea of a constitutional amendment, right? Article 3 says, Article 3 does not actually say lifetime appointments. But what it says is, you sit as a justice in times of good behavior. So as long as you're a good kid, you can sit on the court for the rest of your life. That's where we get lifetime appointment. You'd need a constitutional amendment, and would you take the partisanship out of it if you had these 18-year rotating terms that overlapped every president? So a president, sort of like many commissions in the executive, I'm thinking, well, I'm not going to start naming them, but all sorts of executive agencies where you've got these roaming terms or these overlapping terms. Ironically, it's because of the partisanship that we have right now that you would never get agreement to do this. And I think the other part of it is that I think members of Congress, and I think many people in the United States, still believe that those lifetime terms still, despite what has happened in the past week and a half with Judge Kavanaugh, insulate the court in a way that even just having term limits wouldn't insulate the justices. So I'm very willing to entertain term limit arguments for justices, despite the fact that, for the most part, I'm not willing to entertain arguments about term limits for members of Congress. But that's a different story. But I don't think the case has been made good enough that lifetime appointments are bad.
And this will be the last question.
Sure.
Kudos to you for getting through a pretty good pile. How or does dark money influence the selection process of Supreme Court nominees?
So Robert Bork would argue a lot. I think that the public thinks a lot. I've not seen data on whether there's an effect on senators' votes. Here's the reason. Most lobbying money in Washington, D.C. goes to lobbying groups' friends. Right? If I'm the ACLU, I'm not in Lindsey Graham's office. Why would I be? He's never going to vote for the way I want him to vote. And if I'm the NRA, I'm never in Dianne Feinstein's office. You look at the data on lobbying in Washington, the vast majority of money is going to your friends. I know you're going to vote this way, so it's in some sense an incentive to keep voting that way. I'm not going to change minds. Is there some sense that we could see data someday that all of the money that was spent, and I actually didn't see a lot of Kavanaugh commercials. We watch almost everything on a DVR now, so we don't see many commercials at all. Our 12-year-old's been complaining about political commercials on YouTube. And he complains in particular because he says, everything I watch is like kid stuff. And so they got to know I can't vote. He's smart enough to say, they know I can't vote. Why am I seeing this stuff? Because they can't just, well, they can target. I think in the end, it has an effect. We have not, as political scientists or as legal scholars, been able to pinpoint what that effect is and how it works on individual senators' votes. That's the best I can give you on that. I appreciate all the questions. I like that part of this much more than my initial talk. I love interacting, even though it was third-party interaction. I appreciate it. Great questions. You're a great audience. Thank you.
Thank you.
So my voice